Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Sabrina with the blog Held Fast Home, where I share housecraft, food from scratch recipes, and our journey to slow living. Today, I am sharing the recipe and process for our go-to sourdough bread loaf made entirely with freshly milled flour. This recipe is a less intensive process for time-sensitive schedules. There is a time and a place for hand mixing dough and performing stretch and folds at certain intervals over a period of hours. But for our family, we needed a less involved method that still gave reliable, delicious results. And I'm so happy with the outcome. This dough comes together in a stand mixer, and then we set it and forget it for the rise. After a little more work to portion out the dough, it can be baked 2 hours later, or left in the fridge to ferment overnight, or honestly, until whenever you can get to it. I found that with using 100% freshly milled grains, that the crumb of the bread is more closed than your typical aesthetic sourdough bowl. But while the crumb is closed, I wouldn't say that it's a dense loaf of bread. It's soft, easy to chew, and so good for you. Today, I'll show you how to make this basic artisan recipe as a sandwich loaf and as a traditional sourdough bowl, baked in a Dutch oven. I also want to mention that throughout this voiceover, I'm expecting you to have a familiarity with the sourdough bread making process. This isn't an in-depth beginner 101 course for baking sourdough bread, but this will be an informative video teaching you how to incorporate freshly milled grains into your sourdough bread making process. First, we need to feed our sourdough starter. I just removed mine from the fridge. We need 200 grams of starter for this recipe that will bake up 2 loaves of bread. I added 100 grams of freshly milled flour and 150 grams of filtered water to reach that thick pancake batter consistency. Here's a glimpse at the texture of this mixture. Then I cover the jar with these homemade jar covers and set the jar in a warm place to hasten the rising of the starter. The warmest place for me is right on my stovetop. So while we wait for our starter to double in size, I'm portioning out some more jars with hard wheat berries. Each of these jars has 425 grams of hard wheat berries in it, which is the exact amount of berries needed for a single loaf of my sourdough bread, which is incredibly convenient for grabbing out of the cabinet and milling right when I need them. And then I have the freedom to make a single or a double batch with ease. I highly recommend this hack, especially if you have children or multiple commitments. This just streamlines the entire freshly milled bread making process. I purchased all of my wheat berries from Azure for an incredible price and stellar quality. Once our starter has doubled in size, it should be nice and bubbly. We are wanting to use this starter at its peak, so pay close attention to the surface of the starter. It should not have caved in on itself. This means it has surpassed its peak. We are looking for a subtle arch over the surface, so the starter in the middle of the jar is slightly raised above the starter along the sides of the jar. Now, if your starter has already surpassed its peak, you can still bake with it. The peak is just right at the prime time of baking. Now we mix the dough. Take your stand mixer bowl, place it on the scale, and measure 750 grams of water and 200 grams of starter. I like to mix these two together before adding the rest of the dough ingredients. I'll put this starter in the fridge without feeding it a second time and then remove it when I'm ready for some more bread baking. This method is nearly discard free, which I'm loving at the moment. With most of my energy going into garden preparations, I don't have to worry about using up my discard. Here is a closer look at that bubbly sourdough starter. Then add 850 grams of freshly milled hard wheat berries. Today I'm using 100% hard red wheat berries, but I've also made this with hard white wheat berries and a combination of the two with great results as well. I personally really enjoy the flavor of hard red wheat, and so does my family, and the wheat berries are significantly less expensive than hard white berries. Our grain mill is the Nutri-Mill Harvest grain mill that we've had for over a year now and use at least 4 times a week. We love it, and I'll link my first impressions and unboxing video for you below. It also took only 2 minutes for this grain mill to grind the 850 grams of berries into flour. Then you'll need to add 20 grams of salt, and that is the basic artisan bread recipe. It is linked in the description below for reference. So with all of our ingredients combined, load your bowl into the stand mixer and attach the dough hook. On a low speed, no more than a 2, mix the ingredients together until no dry flour remains. Taking the time to scrape down the sides of the bowl may help with this. You'll be left with a shaggy dough that you'll let sit for 20 to 30 minutes. This is a key step when using freshly milled grains because freshly milled grains require a longer time to absorb the water. If we start kneading this dough in the mixer without waiting for the soak time, our smooth ball of dough will not properly form. Trust me. I'm preparing a large bowl for our first rise. Grease the bowl with your preferred oil so that the dough doesn't stick to the sides of the bowl. I like using a glass bowl because I mark a line on the outside of the bowl with a Sharpie to make it easier to see when the dough has doubled in size. So our shaggy dough has set and soaked, and now it's time to knead it in the stand mixer on medium speed, a 4, until the dough has pulled away from the sides of the bowl and is forming a smooth ball. This usually takes around 8 to 10 minutes. While this kneads, let me talk to you about my stand mixer. I love this stand mixer. It is a KitchenAid Professional 600 series. It has a 6-quart bowl with a handle, and it's a lift mixer. So the head remains stationary, and you lift the lever in the back to raise the bowl to your mixing attachment. One of the reasons I love this mixer is because I bought it at a garage sale for $10. I kid you not. and it is a game changer. We had a 4-quart Faberware stand mixer that we received as a wedding gift that served us well our first few years of marriage, but as our family grew, the capacity just couldn't keep up. If I wanted to make 2 loaves of bread, I'd have to fight the mixer so that the dough wouldn't wind up the mixing attachment. It really turned me away from baking bread because it was such an ordeal. When I found this gem at a garage sale, I could not believe it. I use it all the time and it's so nice to use. It really works with me. The only thing I would say with stand mixers in general is not to leave the kitchen while your dough is kneading in the bowl. As the machine kneads, it could slowly migrate across the counter. I found this true for 3 stand mixers that I've used, and you don't want it to shimmy off the counter. That would be catastrophic. I've stopped the kneading process here at 8 minutes, and then I'm transferring the dough to that greased bowl. Here, we are doing 1 round of stretch and folds before we cover the bowl and let it rise. To perform a stretch and fold, first wet your hands so that the dough does not stick to them. Then take one edge of the dough, making sure you're grabbing from the bottom, and stretch the dough upwards until it is pulled as thin as it can go before tearing. Then fold that section over the rest of the dough, rotate the bowl, and continue these stretch and folds until you have a nice cohesive shape for the rising process. You should begin to feel the dough lose flexibility and the desire to continue stretching. That is a sign that you've completed enough stretch and folds. Cover your bowl, and I like to mark the outside of the bowl where the dough meets the glass to have a line to refer to when judging if the dough has doubled in size. You could also take a picture of your dough before covering it if you don't have a bowl you can mark up. The Sharpie comes right off the glass when we wash it up. I'm sitting this bowl near the warmest part of our house, which again is our stovetop, and now we wait until it has doubled in size. Clean the house, run to the post office, go grocery shopping, you have the time. Here is the dough we are working with after the rise. You can see that slight arch at the surface of the dough, similar to the rounded surface of our starter at the beginning of this video. This shows that the dough has not overproofed. If it had overproofed, the dough wouldn't hold its shape as much, and it might be a little soupy. Now I'm gathering all the essentials for the next few steps. We'll need 1 loaf pan, 1 linen-lined proofing basket or bowl, a dough knife, and a grocery sack. First, grease the loaf pan with butter. This helps the finished loaf to just fall out of the pan perfectly after baking. Then dump your dough onto a clean, dry counter and separate it in half with your dough knife. The next step I do here is called laminating the dough. This is where I gently thin out the dough while forming it into a slight rectangle shape, similar to making cinnamon rolls. Just don't use a rolling pin here. Use damp fingertips. Once you've thinned out the dough, fold it like a brochure, folding one side in by 1/3 of the size of the rectangle, and then folding the opposite side to rest on top of the first. Now take that short edge of this smaller rectangle and roll it over the rest of the dough so that you now have a cylinder. Since this one is going into a loaf pan, we are trying to build tension along this log shape. Slightly tuck the ends and continue rolling the cylinder towards you. Then move the dough higher on the counter and pull it toward you again. You're working with the counter to build tension on the surface of the oblong dough. Once you're satisfied with the tension, place the dough into your prepped loaf pan and cover with a tea towel or bowl cover, leaving it out on the counter to rise no more than 2 hours before baking. This loaf I let rise for just 1 more hour before baking it. Bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 25 to 30 minutes or until the internal temp is 160 degrees Fahrenheit. If you do not have the time to bake it or are looking for a longer second ferment, you can place this loaf pan in a grocery sack and pop it in the fridge until you're ready to bake it. We'll do just that for our next bread loaf. Just let the loaf pan come to room temperature before putting it in the oven so that the glass does not shatter. Moving on to shaping the sourdough boule. We're starting with that same laminating step, gently manipulating the dough into a thin, rectangular sheet, folding the short edges inward with a trifold, then rolling the dough in on itself until you have a short, squat cylinder. To shape this into a round loaf, we are again working with the counter to create tension. Start the dough away from you and gently pull it closer toward you, while tucking in the ends. The slight stick of the counter should start to create tension on the surface of the dough without any tearing. Now you have a slightly log shape, so maneuver the dough away from you with the short side of the log facing you. Gently guide the dough toward you again. Now you have a slightly rounded shape. Continue rounding the dough and creating tension with this method as you rotate the dough. Once you've achieved shape and tension, transfer the dough face down into your floured and lined proofing container. I'm securing the tension we created by crisscrossing and tacking the bottom of the sourdough that is now face up. Insert your container into the grocery sack, tie off the end, and chill in the fridge for 2 hours or up to overnight. For this tutorial, I fermented my dough overnight. Here I am later in the evening baking the sandwich loaf, just 1 hour after I placed it into the loaf pan. Look at how beautifully it popped out of the loaf pan. So in the morning, before placing my Dutch oven in the oven, I like to toss in an ice cube or two to create a more humid environment. Preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Also, on a side note here, my Dutch oven is a 7 or 9 quart Dutch oven, I can't remember which, but a single sourdough boule will fit in a 5 quart Dutch oven. Once our covered Dutch oven has preheated and been in the oven for at least 30 minutes because you want it super hot, I remove our dough from the fridge, carefully turn it out onto parchment paper, brush off that extra flour, and score the dough to allow steam to escape without ripping or misshapening the bread. No scoring tutorial here, just a basic kind of wheat-like stalk and a crescent. Bake covered for 20 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Uncover, then bake for another 20 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I make sure to reduce the temperature first before even opening the oven to remove the Dutch oven lid. Otherwise, there's a 50-50 chance I forget to reduce the temperature. Once your bread is finished baking, allow it to cool completely before cutting into it. I cannot stress this enough because the texture of the entire loaf is ruined when you cut into a still warm loaf. I understand that sometimes our schedule just doesn't allow for that, but if you can, let it cool for at least 2 hours. Now let's cut into these freshly milled sourdough loaves. Sadly, this artisan loaf is a little out of frame, but you can still see the crumb. I'm trying to show you how soft this loaf is, even with entirely freshly milled flour and no oil. I love these artisan loaves for toast with my eggs in the morning and more rustic sandwiches. Here is a look at that sandwich loaf. I'm trying to emphasize how flexible the bread is, even though it's made with 100% freshly milled flour and no oil. While the bread is flexible, it's also sturdy and doesn't crumble when you cut into it. So good for PB&Js. Thank you so much for being here. I hope this video helped you with understanding how to bake sourdough bread entirely with freshly milled grains. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to get back to you. If you're interested in learning more about my grain mill, I'll link that video below. I'll also link a Simple Farmhouse Life podcast episode that goes into the history and benefits of freshly milled grains if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the information on that. Thank you so much again, and I will see you next time.